Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our second annual Scholar in Residence webinar sponsored by the NSF Center for Sustainable Nanotechnology. My name is Miriam Kraus, and I'm the Director of Education, Outreach, and Diversity for the CSN. The CSN is a center for chemical innovation funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation. And that means that we are a multi-institute collaboration. We have about 15 or 16 faculty members spread across a dozen institutions around the United States. And along with that, about 50 assorted undergraduate and graduate students, postdoctoral scholars, and that includes a number of summer undergraduate research students who are joining us now for a 10-week experience over the summer. So our CSN Scholar in Residence program just started last year as a way to engage with and support a scholar from outside the CSN. It emphasizes support for work that is complementary to CSN science, so it's not aimed at nanoscientists who are doing work related to CSN science, but it could be people who are scholars in science communication, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, technology transfer, science education, or other related work to our focus of our center. So we were very excited when Professor Theresa Gaines, our speaker for tonight, agreed to be our second ever Scholar in Residence, following in the incomparable footsteps of our first Scholar in Residence, Professor Rachel Burks, last year. Dr. Gaines is an assistant professor of chemistry at Delta State University, where she primarily teaches organic chemistry. She's also the creator of Big Magnet Games and has created several educational games to help undergraduate students learn chemistry. And I can say that I am not a chemist, but after playing one of those games at one of our meetings, I felt like I was totally ready to take an organic chemistry quiz. Dr. Gaines enjoys exploring all kinds of creative ways to engage learners in chemistry, and she is also an amateur cheesemaker. For tonight's webinar, she will be presenting Elevated, Disassociated, Complicated, Prioritizing Equity in Chemistry. And this is a topic that is obviously hugely important to STEM education and to the field of chemistry more broadly. So I'm super excited to introduce Dr. Theresa Gaines for tonight's CSN Scholar in Residence webinar. So thank you so much, Dr. Gaines, for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for having me. Well, hello guys, and welcome. I'm really excited to be here with you guys and to kind of give this talk of where I've been headspace-wise in preparing for our fall semester. So let's see. Hopefully you can see my screen now.
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, we can see.
Okay, awesome. So welcome. Thank you, Miriam, for such a wonderful introduction. It was way better than mine. I pulled my Twitter bio. There we go. Where again, my name is Theresa Gaines. I am a professor at Delta State University. I'm beginning my third year, and I teach mostly organic chemistry. But I have an interest in chemistry games and making chemistry games, and I also make cheese. Yes, and feel free as we go along, if you have questions that you want to ask, we can talk with them or talk about them then and there. We don't have to wait towards the end. A little bit about where I am. So I'm in Cleveland, Mississippi, where I don't think many people know where that is. But it's kind of like right on the border of Mississippi and Arkansas, about halfway between Memphis, Tennessee, and Jackson, Mississippi. And in Wisconsin, you're excited to see the headwear. Yes, I could go back to that. I was recently sent this cheese hat, and I'm so excited. I've wanted one for the longest time, so thank you guys. So how did I get here? Elevated, disassociated, complicated, equity in chemistry. There's a couple of things that kind of happened all at once to kind of get me to ask this question of what does equity in chemistry look like? So it primarily starts with in late January of 2020, as a part of a teaching fellowship that I was in. I had a colleague who was also in that fellowship come and sit in on one of my organic chemistry classes. And the sit-in went well, and they took some notes and gave me some really helpful feedback. But they asked me a question that caught me off guard, and it really probably shouldn't have. And the question, because this colleague was in the English department, and the question was, what is organic chemistry about? What are students supposed to be learning in this class? And in particular, they asked if I had like 3 main themes of organic chemistry. And I found that question very hard to ask, because in chemistry, and especially organic chemistry, we tend to say, well, everything's important. Like, there are these things that are all connected, but we typically don't organize our courses into major themes. And this colleague challenged me to not take these as rhetorical questions, but really kind of sit down and wrestle with this. If I couldn't describe the overarching themes of organic chemistry, how could I expect my students to pick up what they might be? So it kind of started with this question. And then about a month and a half later, we went remote due to COVID-19. So we said goodbye right before spring break, and then we never returned to campus for instruction. Instead, we were online. And so in this like mad scramble that myself and other educators and researchers are doing, to figure out, how do we teach in a pandemic? How do we do research in a pandemic? And suddenly we had all of these like options of, oh yes, you can do this course online, or you can do this type of assessment. And kind of the question that was kind of humming in the background was, well, if we have the ability to provide all of these sorts of ways to interact with chemistry content, and provide accessible ways to engage in the course, how come we can't do this all of the time? How come we can't have this flexibility all of the time? Because there are students who needed this even before the pandemic, but we just said no because maybe we thought it was inconvenient. The third thing that I think contributed to me asking this question was the conversation that happened and is still ongoing about online proctoring systems. Some of them can be very invasive, asking students to turn on their cameras, asking them to take pictures of their rooms, which can be very embarrassing. Maybe they are sharing a room, maybe they are housing insecure. And so there was a pushback from some faculty, and actually I think a lot of faculty, on trying to not use these systems. And so, in saying, okay, well, if I don't want to use this tool that was made for a certain type of assessment, what other types of assessments can I use? And how can I resist other tools that are looking to prioritize conformity and obedience? And how can I set up a relationship with students built on trust, so that we don't need to, so that there's no pressure from the faculty end or the student end to use these outside systems. And then the last one was, even though I resisted and didn't use any online proctoring systems because of the situation of COVID, I still had students who used the Chegg expert feature to complete their assessments for them. And so kind of the question from there was, just saying I'm not going to use a proctoring software wasn't enough. Just saying I'm going to change my assessment wasn't enough. The expectations of the class didn't suit where my students were at. And when I talked with them about why they decided to go to Chegg, it wasn't that they didn't think that they were capable of doing the assignment, but they had too much on their plate at one time. They were working, they were taking care of family. We were in the middle of pandemic. They had too much going on, and this, what they called was their last resort, ended up being their only option. So how do I create a classroom environment that doesn't force students into this sort of position? So at least during this time, I found myself not getting a lot of sleep, because all of these different things kind of crystallized in a question that seemed very thematic. And that question was, what does equity in chemistry look like? Oh, great question. What is Chegg? Chegg is a service where they do a couple of things. They rent textbooks to students, and that's where they first kind of got their start. But they also have a feature where students can submit like a test or a homework to an expert, and that expert will then solve it for them and give them the answers back. And so at least like within STEM teaching, Chegg is a villain in the space. Because even though, like, I think a service like Chegg having like an online tutor, an expert that you can access to help you figure things out, I think that's fine. But Chegg just has you submit whatever you have. And it's, even though in their policy they say they don't want people submitting tests or cheating or doing homework, there's no action to prevent students from doing that. No, yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking. And so it's kind of crystallized in this question of what does equity in chemistry look like? And I didn't know. I found myself feeling very restless over this question. Specifically, like, what does equity in the chemistry classroom look like? What would equity in my classroom look like? I think kind of from that first evaluation where my colleague came and asked, like, what's the purpose of this course? What are students supposed to be doing here? All the way to the point where I'm in a one-on-one session with a student who's crying because they know they made a poor decision that like could jeopardize their performance in the class. There was inequity all the way like connecting as the through line. So I've been doing a lot of thinking since then. And I don't profess to have all of the answers, but at least I want to show kind of where I've traveled so far in my sleepless nights. So the first thing that I want to do is, if you feel like you don't have permission to begin in this space because you feel like, oh, I might not know enough, I want to give you permission to begin, just in case you need it. And I want to start by introducing a friend of mine. Their stage name, or his stage name, is Vagabond Maurice. He is a musician, and I took his Twitter bio where it says dragon, writer, and lyricist. And so I think in our current pandemic times, having friends that you've met and known exclusively through the internet is pretty normal now. But Maurice and I have been friends for about 17 years or so. So it's been a long while. And the reason why I want to introduce Maurice, aside from saying you should listen to his album, but the title, Elevated, Disassociated, Complicated, is a line from his new album from the title track, Stairway to Heaven. And I want to bring this up because Maurice is no stranger to growth and metamorphosis. And I want to take a little bit of time to explain why this is, and why I think it's a good example for us. I think the last album that he put out was about 3 years or so, and he's had several like mini albums and EPs since before then. But Maurice follows this cycle where all of his songs, sorry, I bumped my mic. All of his songs are about his growth over the past time since he's written his last album. They're lyrically like very, very beautiful. It's jazz inspired, hip hop inspired, anime and like nerd culture inspired. But he kind of goes through like these different metamorphoses where he's learning and growing and reflecting, and then out comes an album like in all of its glory, and then this process kind of starts all over again, and then out pops this other album. But the kind of the theme is each time, each iteration, there's something new and beautiful and worthwhile that's come out of this journey as he gets closer and closer and closer to where he envisions that he might end up musically or on his personal journey. And so this kind of theme, I've seen this before in a book called Iterate by John Sharp and Colleen Macklin, where they talk about being reflective practitioners, where there's two aspects or two types of reflection: reflection in action and reflection on action, which were both first coined by Donald Schoen. And reflection in action is thinking on your feet, where you're doing an action, and as you're doing this action, you're thinking, wait, should I be doing it this way? Maybe I need to tilt my hand, or maybe I need to do some other minute detail in the process. And then there's reflection on action, where after you've done something, you take a step back and then you evaluate, now that you're not in the process anymore. And in this cycle, and in this place where you have reflection in action and reflection on action, we can turn experience into knowledge that we can then use to improve, right? This is iterative, an iterative type of growth. And so if you're worried, like initially I was worried, and I usually am worried whenever I'm trying to jump into something new, I get it in my head like, oh, I'm not going to be very good at this. I don't know what I'm doing, but that's okay. Because at least in growing incrementally, starting from where we are, we can still get a little bit closer to where we want to end up. And at least in this book, they say that it's called failing better. In another universe, this talk probably would have been all about this book. It's very, very good. I strongly recommend it. But if you're looking for permission to kind of jump into trying something new with what you can and where you are, you have permission, if you were wanting that. So we have a big question if we're going to talk about equity, right? Elevated, disassociated, complicated, right? Everybody's talking about equity, I feel like, within academia, and I think it's worth, at least within the context of this talk, saying, okay, what do we mean by equity in this context? Because depending on your context, your definition of equity that you're using might be something different. And there's a book called Equity-Centered Trauma-Informed Education, which I think came out a couple of months ago. But they have a really great definition that I think applies if we're looking at the classroom. And in this book, they say all students should be capable of learning, or all students are capable of learning, and they should have access to an education that helps them learn and grow. So this is going to be what, like when we say we want equity in the chemistry classroom, this is what we want. We have to acknowledge that all students are capable of learning, and that it's our duty to help them access, either resources or through us, an education that helps them learn and grow. And in chemistry, I think we don't have a good track record with this. And I think for those of us who are chemists, we might understand, and also other people in other STEM fields probably get this, but for chemistry, this tweet sums up a very common interaction where you're on a flight and you're talking to your seatmate next to you who you don't know, like making small talk before you take off. I see Christy in the chat saying, yep. And someone's like, oh, what do you study or what do you do? And it's like, oh, chemistry. And then suddenly they're like, they tell you all of the awful experiences they've had in chemistry. Their professor was horrible. They didn't learn anything. They didn't see why it was important. It was such a waste of time, or it killed their dream. They weren't able to become a doctor. Like, this is trauma. Chemistry has a really bad reputation of traumatizing people, so that as soon as you mention that this is what you do as a profession or for fun, you get such a response. Will's commented that this has happened to doctors. Oh, I bet. I bet. So I think this book, Equity-Centered Trauma-Informed Education, is going to be, oh, his doctors tell him they hated organic. Oh, no. I see Miriam in the chat. Oh, no. It's everywhere, especially organic chemistry. I've never had an experience where I say, oh, I do organic chemistry, and someone has said, oh, yeah, I enjoyed that class. I remember learning about this. It's never that. But that's what I want. So I'm very excited to dig deeper into this book. And I think it will have a lot of good advice for us in chemistry, aside from providing a definition of equity. So I want to take a look at a couple of things. And first, if we're talking about equity in the classroom, first, I think we need to look at who our learners are. Who are the people who are coming into our classrooms as our students? Because we might have some assumptions, and depending on what those assumptions are, if we're wrong, we might create more inequities in how we're interacting with our students. So, oh wait, let's see. Mike says, you've heard this sort of thing many times, but you never connected it to equity before. Yeah. They didn't have access to a chemistry education that enabled them to learn and grow. It's an equity issue. So when I think about equity, I usually, in STEM specifically, I usually go to thinking about the leaky pipeline, where we say, okay, we have these students who are traveling from, when they're young kids all the way through our educational system. And we have a lot of people who are interested in science, enthusiastic about STEM. And when we, look at the end of the pipeline, there's only a fraction of who we started with. We've lost them. They've fallen off somewhere. So we usually call this a leaky pipeline. And the NSF, through the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, they compile some data every few years where they look at some statistics for women, minorities, people with disabilities in science and engineering. And the two takeaways from from this year's report was, I think, interesting, because we usually pair diversity, equity, inclusion together, and we say, yeah, we need to recruit like students to get into STEM. We need to go to these high schools and middle schools, and we need to get them involved, which is true. But at least at this point, when it comes to women and minorities in STEM, they're applying to STEM majors at the same rate per proportion of their national makeup. They're applying to STEM degrees at the same rates as their white and non-Pacific Islander Asian counterparts are. The problem is when we come in, we're like, okay, like we're seeing the numbers that we're expecting to see. But the problem is when it comes to graduation time, we're not seeing the same numbers. We're losing our minority students. So there's some sort of black box that happens in the 4-year undergraduate education for our students, where they come in, they're interested in STEM, and then by the time that they're graduating, they've either left school altogether or they've left their STEM program altogether. And actually, Dr. Estrada and colleagues wrote a really good paper, Improving Underrepresented Minority Student Persistence in STEM, that called out there's a lack of institutional accountability in identifying and tracking students who leave STEM. Because if you can identify them, then you can ask the question of why. By not tracking, we kind of leave this black box to say, oh, it's a mystery. Who knows why students, minority students or LGBTQ plus students or students with disabilities are leaving? Without tracking students, it's really hard to dig into the issues of why this is happening. And so they make a really strong call for institutional accountability. Because without the ability to go in and say, okay, why are we doing this? Or why is this happening? We leave it to ourselves to make up answers, and we might fall into perpetuating some stereotypes, or saying, oh, these students aren't cut out for it, or, oh, these students aren't good at science, they're not good at math, when it's possible that that's, and probable that that's not the case. So we have the leaky pipeline, but I think it's also interesting to look at who students are today. Because at least when I first read this, so this is a paper from the Journal of Chemical Education. This is a summary of some statistics that they have. But students today entering into college are increasingly first-generation students. Up to 33% of all incoming freshmen are first-generation students. And this is important because this means that they might not have somebody close to them who's navigated college before them, which means they're learning how to do this college thing all on their own. And that is exhausting. First-generation students are more than twice as likely to leave STEM majors than non-first generation students. Up to 40% of incoming students or current students are working at least 30 hours per week. And about 25% of them are juggling a full-time job. 1 in 5 have children that they are caring for. And then also students today are facing higher rates of food insecurity and housing insecurity than previous generations. And so with this in mind, right, if we come from the outset in our course design, or when we're approaching our classes knowing, okay, my students are likely to have children that they're caring for, or elder or other family that they're caring for, they might be juggling a full-time job, that should inform what your demands are from them outside of the classroom, right? This should change how you're trying to assess them if the assessment needs to happen outside of the course. And I think this makes clear that a one size can't fit all here. If we're teaching the way that we were taught back when, you know, we had less first generation students, less students who were working full time, we're not creating a system where our new student population or our new demographics will be able to thrive. So these ones were national, but within the individual papers, they're no, I think they were just all national. I think that original, so I think you can go to the original NSF, this one at the bottom. For this one, they do break it down, and so you can search. But at least for my institution, we have high rates of first generation students. We have over half of our students are working at least part-time as well. But yeah, this report is the one to go to. Absolutely. So with our students in mind, the next thing that I kind of stumbled my way through was thinking about power and purpose. So when it comes to power, which it feels a little awkward to talk about, but there's a lot of power in chemistry classrooms, and it's power that the professor tends to have to themselves. Whether or not I like it, like grades have a lot of power. Students are worried about their grades. They're worried about their GPA, especially in organic chemistry, where this is a very important class for many students, because if they don't pass this class, they can't go to med school or dental school or pharmacy school. And so even though as a professor, as someone who's graduated a while ago, my GPA doesn't mean much to me. My college GPA doesn't mean much to me anymore. But for students, this means a lot to them. And so because I'm the one who has control over their grade and thereby over their GPA, there's a lot of power that I hold. And when this is combined with the fact that in their experience, they might have been trained through their educational experience to be obedient in order to succeed, this gives me another source of power, which is reputation. Because when they're applying to their other programs, after they've passed on from my class, they might come back for letters of recommendation. And so there's a lot of power that I hold there as well. And I put Bell Hooks's Teaching to Transgress at the bottom here, because in the introduction, Bell Hooks talks about her experience in school, where she started school in a segregated school. However, during her time between elementary school and high school, the schools were integrated and she was bused to other schools. And in that introduction, Bell Hooks talks about how learning at these integrated schools was suddenly about obedience to authority. And she talked about how in those places, obedience was equated with learning. If you do what the professor says when the professor says it and the way that they say it, then you'll get the grade that you want and you'll be able to move on from there. And so I think in the worst of cases, many classrooms might operate in this way, where you just need to get on the professor's good side, learn what they like, and then you can succeed and move on from there. So there's a lot of power there. And the problem, and this is the problem that I ran into when I found my students using the Chegg expert service, was that if a student associates their grade with the only way to achieve their dream, right, they might make something that I think is a poor decision, but to them it might be the logical decision, right? If the grade is the only thing that they need, if it doesn't really matter what they know, right, they're going to choose the path of least resistance to get the grade that they need. It's logical. It makes sense. And Alfie Kohn has a great essay called The Case Against Grades. And Alfie Kohn and other scholars kind of point to grades kind of being at the crux of this issue. Because grades do a couple of things. Grades diminish student interest in learning. Grades create a preference for the easiest task, right? If a student chooses to do something hard or take a harder course, right, maybe they don't perform as well, it lowers their GPA, versus taking a course that can get them an easy A, they keep their high GPA. And grades reduce the quality of students learning as well. And there was a meme that went viral at the beginning of this year that I think kind of encapsulates, right, kind of this tension where students are learning to play the game of education, right? We have this educational system, and all games are systems. We have this educational system, and students are wanting a certain reward, and they're getting there, but it's not the one that we as the designers of this system, it's not exactly the way that we want. So I don't know if you guys remember this. It was a TikTok that that went viral. So hopefully you can hear this.
No, we can't hear. We may need to reshare maybe with the, because now there's a little box where you have to check to share your audio.
Let's see. We'll run it back.
There it is.
This is a square.
Okay.
Can you guess which spot that goes in?
The square.
That's right. It goes in the square hole.
Yes. Okay.
Oh, this is your first TikTok?
And how about this rectangle? That one
Also the square.
that goes in there too.
Yeah.
Up next, we've got this thin rectangle.
The thin
Can
rectangle.
you guess where that goes?
The thin rectangle.
That's right. It goes in the square hole. And up next, a cylinder.
The circle.
I think that goes in
The circle.
the square hole. Now, we've also got this semicircle right here. Do you see a slot that would fit
The semicircle.
semicircle?
The semicircle.
That's right. It's the square hole. Okay. Up next, the triangle. We know what hole that goes
The
into,
triangle.
right?
Triangle.
That's right. The square hole. And up next, we have the arch.
The arch. The arch.
You guessed it.
The arch.
It goes in the square hole.
You didn't see this one? Oh, Natalie saw this one. So this TikTok went viral, and a lot of people were posting their caption. And I didn't find this tweet, but the first time I saw this was somebody retweeted this TikTok and posted the caption, like a first attempt at course design, right? We're having this problem where like there's clearly a setup for some sort of process to happen here. But it's not exactly fine-tuned for what we're wanting, or for the shapes to match, since everything can just fit in the square hole. I think we have a similar problem when we're thinking about the systems that we're enacting as part of education. If everything can fit into the square hole, the path of least resistance for students is just to put everything in the square hole. So we might need to think a little bit more creatively about how we're setting things up. So when it comes to, okay, what does this look like when it comes to grading? There's a growing body of educators looking to decenter grades in the classroom. And so there are all sorts of terms floating around: mastery grading, specifications-based grading, standards-based grading. There's contract grading, there's ungrading. All of these are different ways of trying to minimize the weight and the value and the focus of grades in a classroom, so that hopefully students can focus more on learning. But at least within chemical education literature, in 2015, Melanie Cooper, who's from Michigan State University, actually kind of said we need to make sure we do something else. So although reform efforts call for evidence-based pedagogical approaches like standards-based grading, mastery grading, supporting learning environments, and changing to the faculty teaching culture and reward systems, grades being a reward system, one important aspect needs more attention: changing expectations about what students should learn, particularly in introductory college-level STEM courses. This demands that faculty seriously discuss within and across disciplines how they approach their curricula. So even though, and this is where a lot of my work has been, in trying to figure out, okay, how am I assessing? How can I just give feedback and not give a grade? How can I decenter the focus of grades? And I tried this throughout the past school year, fall 2020 and spring 2021, where we had a whole bunch of assessments. It was feedback based, but I think I missed this part. We need to change expectations of how much we're asking students to learn, because I think we're running, especially in chemistry, I think we're running into an issue. Tracy McGill and colleagues at Emory University have actually overhauled their whole chemistry curriculum, called Chemistry Unbound, and that's what they call it. Where they've reorganized courses, they've split them up. There's no longer a traditional Gen Chem 1, Gen Chem 2, Organic 1, Organic 2. They've gone and they've searched for different themes that are cross-cutting throughout all of chemistry, and they've completely redone everything. And in their paper, where they kind of introduce and showcase what they've done in their early results, they mentioned something that I thought was really interesting. Over the past 50 years or so, a lot has changed within chemistry. A lot has changed within organic chemistry. But all we do in the classes is we say, okay, we added, students need to know this. And we've kept everything confined to those 2 semesters. And so every chemistry course or introductory chemistry course, at least that I've experienced, has just been a mad dash through all of the content, because there's so much to cover. And at least recently, even on Twitter, people have been talking about this. Andre the chemist said, chemistry is ace at adding new content for students to learn without removing stuff to make room for it. No one does it better than chemistry. And I think this is along with their other critiques of traditional chemistry curricula, I think that this is one that really rings close to home in organic chemistry. It goes back to the question my colleague asked, like, what are students supposed to learn here? And I was like, well, everything is important, because we've crammed, or we're trying to cram everything into this 2-semester sequence, and there's way too much content. Yep, and everyone knows it's too much. And by the next semester, students have forgotten what they learned because they never thoroughly learned in the first place. Exactly. Absolutely. So when I think about the power that I have in a chemistry classroom, I kind of came to three main things. I have power in three areas at my institution. And if you're looking to change your classroom, the power that you might have in your classroom might differ based on policy or if you're teaching in tandem with other people teaching the same course. But at least I have complete autonomy over setting my course learning outcomes. I can set those to be whatever I want. I just need to set those and have them ready before the semester starts. I have autonomy over assessment methods. How I choose to assess my students is completely up to me. And then also content delivery within reason. I can't suddenly make my class online or not, but in a face-to-face environment, I can choose if it's going to be a flipped classroom or semi-flipped, or if we're going to do lectures. I have complete autonomy to change things around. So yes, we are constricted by ACS accreditation, but I think it's interesting at my school because we haven't had an organic chemistry person for a while. Before I came, they made sure that all of the accreditation requirements would be completed in multiple areas, so that, because there's only 4 of us. So if we have a year where somebody's gone, we can still make sure that we're covering things. So our ACS accreditation is with our program learning outcomes. So long as my course learning outcomes can be related to our program learning outcomes, we're good there. So these are the places where I have power. And also in the ACS, speaking of ACS guidelines, there's a lot of room for flexibility, because ACS, they ask for certain things to be covered, and they ask where it's covered. So an example is polymers or macromolecules. It needs to be covered somewhere. So it could be one class, or it could be multiple classes that have a component. So there is a lot of flexibility there depending on how you want to set things up. And so I think the only other place where I do have some restriction is for assessment methods. Because as far as ACS goes, they talk about communication, written and oral, but that's also very vague. So there's a lot of flexibility within that. But at least with the university, by policy, we're only required to provide a midterm grade and a final grade. Anything else leading up to that is up to us for the most part. So I have a lot of flexibility there, more than most people might have at their own institutions. But I would like to highlight Dr. Spencer Bagley teaches math at the University of Utah. He has a great talk. Follow him on Twitter, by the way. He has a great talk called Ungrading as Resistance, where he kind of goes through his process of trying to figure out what he can do with the power that he has in his class, because it's very different than the flexibility that I have in my classes. So I started with learning outcomes, my course learning outcomes, because I was inspired by somebody else that you might want to follow on Twitter if you're interested in this discussion on grades specifically, by Jesse Stommel. He's the person who first coined the term ungrading. But he posted this tweet in June saying, thinking about learning outcomes and how rarely they adequately reflect our values. Which ones like this were more common? I learn from you and reflect on that learning reflect that learning back to the community, or we'll build an equitable community where everybody's voice is valued. And I was really, really inspired by that tweet. And in revisiting my learning outcomes, I decided to incorporate those. So I have LDIs, which are learner development intentions. So I want my students to learn how to make claims and justify them with evidence. I want them to practice reflection through metacognitive practices, and I want them to be a supportive class community member. And so, at least on this end, this was like a place where I could easily implement something, because at least for learning outcomes, these are a useful tool in communicating to students. This is what I think is valuable, instead of the list of like 25 discrete chemistry concepts that I want them to learn. Instead, something like this might be or I think could be a better communication tool in saying, for our classroom environment, for our skills that will transcend this chemistry class, what am I wanting you to develop? So I can use the power I have in the classroom to do this. But on the same side, there's a lot of power that I have. And if I want an equitable chemistry class, there's no system of equity where one person has all the power that I know of. I haven't seen any example of that. And so I have a lot of power to share. And the first place where I considered this was back in May. I came across, and I think it was from the CSN, one of the CSN professional development, maybe. But there was this list, of characteristics of white supremacy culture. And not to say that this was my classroom, or this is how I found it, in case like kind of that phrase makes you feel uncomfortable. But if there's an inequitable system that has certain characteristics, I might want to make sure that if I'm trying to build an equitable classroom, that I don't have these same characteristics that are represented in this inequitable system. And they give a list of 14 things that I thought were very interesting. So an emphasis on perfectionism, a sense of urgency, defensiveness when authority is challenged, quantity over quality, what they call worship of the written word, where things have to be, certain types of information are more valuable than other modes of communicating. The idea that there's only one right way to do things, or things are this or that, power hoarding, paternalism, fear of open conflict, individualism, objectivity, the right to comfort, progress is bigger or more without regard to who might be left behind, and trying to pursue that. All of these things were things that to some extent I saw in my classroom, and that I either acted on or felt the urge to in my classroom. And it all has to do with power. Specifically, defensiveness, right? If a student is challenging me about something that they thought was unfair, if my first response is to be very defensive and say, well, it's this way because I say so, because I'm the professor, that is inherently an inequitable system. Paternalism, I know what's best because I'm the one who has all the power, and you should just trust that I have your own best interest in mind, even though I might not have given you adequate reason to believe so. Fear of open conflict, the idea of trying to keep the peace, even though some people might be in a very unfair situation and need someone to champion them instead of silence them. I would highly recommend reading through this list by Timo Kuhn. And they have like a description of like what this might look like, but also things that you can do to combat this. And so I think this was, at least for me, really eye-opening, and things for me to keep in mind, because this is a way to share power, right? If I don't have to demand perfection from my students, if my students can focus on their growth instead of just completing all of these assessments just to bring a number count up, I think there's a lot of places where this can be woven in making a more equitable classroom environment. let's see. And I think one that I did want to point out specifically is objectivity. I think there is this characterization that science is objective, right? People say science doesn't care how you feel. Like, you know, your feelings don't matter when it comes to science, or your identity as a scientist, or your identity, your personal beliefs. But that's not exactly true. So Dr. Stephanie Gaines had an article in the Journal of Chemical Education titled "Why I Come Out to My Chemistry Class" that I thought was very, very compelling. And if we're trying to build an equitable system, there has to be community. And there's no way to build a community without instilling a sense of belonging and validating people's identities, because without that, they don't feel welcome. They might not feel welcome in these spaces. So I'd highly recommend giving this a look through if you haven't seen this before. So the third thing is relationships and community. If we want equity in the classroom, right, we can change all of our assessments and we can try to kind of decenter our focus on grades, and we can change our learning outcomes and our learning intentions. But without student partnership, there's no way that it can be equitable, because it's still one person holding all of the power. So back in this book, Equity-Centered Trauma-Informed Education, to talk about unconditional positive regard, where obedience to the instructor or whoever's in authority is not a prerequisite for acceptance. Learners are accepted for who they are, as they are, without their performance in the class being a factor. So when we think about teacher-student interaction and student-student interaction, setting unconditional positive regard as the foundation is necessary in order to build an equitable classroom community. And then to that, because somebody's sense of belonging or status in the class shouldn't be related to their progress in the course, if we're going to have this system, we need to prioritize growth and give space for growth, where students can make missteps, they can make mistakes and not be punished for it, but have a chance to do it again. Some places in the literature where we see people talking about this aspect, second chance grading, which this paper from Primus talks about second chance grading in math courses, feedback-based assignments with revisions, where the first time students turn in something, they only get feedback and then they're encouraged to revise and resubmit, or portfolio-based courses where students are building a bigger body of work, and so no one individual assignment holds weight outside of that larger context. And in prioritizing growth, we need to think of, if we want to do something different, how do we assess or capture that growth? Because at least from a reporting side, right, we need to be able to capture and justify what kind of data we're getting out of this for our department, our institution. And if you're looking for different ways to do this, this book came out in 2020, Ungrading. Each chapter is written by a different person. Some of these people you've seen in tweets that I've spread out throughout this presentation. But it was edited by Dr. Susan Bloom at the University of Notre Dame. And the thing that I like about each chapter being written by a different person is you see kind of different ways that people are trying to decenter grades to give room for students to demonstrate their growth. It's not all, nobody has a grade. There are certainly most of the chapters in this book, people are assigning grades or grading, but ungrading as this idea of decentering or devaluing a grade in pursuit of helping students be intrinsically motivated to learn. when it comes to student content interaction, giving students agency. And this is a lot of work. And I don't know how well this would work with larger classes. The places that I've seen this have had smaller classes. But asking students what they're interested in and then weaving that into the course content. Asking them to reflect on their own project, to self-assess, to assess each other, giving them the tools to make some of the decisions about what's happening in the classroom throughout the semester. Let's see, do I have a sense for how organic faculty view this approach? You can see resistance to the work involved in redoing and retooling curriculum, but you can also see resistance due to the I had to suffer, so you should too mentality. Yes. It depends on the person. I've talked with, I'm the only organic person at my institution, but even with my other chemistry faculty, they're very resistant to changing things because it's a lot of work that they otherwise wouldn't have to do. They don't need to retool their classes. They can reuse the same stuff that they've been doing before, maybe update a thing or two here and there. But it is a large overhaul. So at least because I have kind of autonomy within my bubble of classes, I can implement things and try things in my space, but there's no way I can have, I don't have authority over other classes. And yes, that I had to suffer, so you should too mentality. I'm not sure how to get around that. I think with a lot of topics that we see going on with the bill where families with children are now getting money every month to help curb child poverty, a lot of people were against that because they said, well, I didn't have it, right? So I'm not exactly sure where and how to get buy-in, especially for some of our larger issues. Because right now I'm just talking about in the classroom. What about beyond? I have a list of other places here. Like, what about with undergraduate research experience? Only people who are in the know have the best shot. Only students who have the best grades are able to climb all the way up. We could try to convince faculty to take students who are less prepared, but they might not want to. Or what about the tenure and promotion process, where people who are in the LGBT plus community, or people who are disabled, or people who are minorities might take on extra tasks related to their identity that don't necessarily count. And some people just say, well, that's the way it's always been. That was never counted before. So why should we change it? I don't have an answer for that. I can't comprehend why that would be someone's outlook. And so I don't have. Yeah, I hope so. I hope that when there's enough people kind of on this and advocating for these sorts of things that are clearly perpetuating inequity in a major way. But I don't think we've reached a critical mass yet of these things. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's been my biggest problem kind of in-house. I'm receiving a lot of encouragement from colleagues, but not a lot of enthusiasm that they are wanting to implement these things themselves. And so I do think one place where we might be able to work with this, because there's a lot of ideas out there, but so Michigan State University, they rehauled their chemistry program with the Chemistry of Life, Universe, and Everything called CLUE, and they have a Gen Chem version and an organic version. Emory has Chemistry Unbound. Those are the first two like big curriculum overhauls that I've seen. And and those don't work for everyone. So I think places where we see people reforming an individual class because maybe they're not interconnected, and putting those tools out there, I think that might be very useful in building, because not everybody has the time to kind of go through and rebuild their class from the course up like I'm trying to do with my organic chemistry course. But making those tools available, just like for Chemistry Unbound and OCLU have done, I think it makes it easier if someone has a high activation energy, so to say, for getting on board. If someone could provide materials that they can then adapt instead of starting all the way from zero, that might be something to convince people. But I don't think we have enough. I don't think we have enough out there yet. So yeah, I definitely don't think that I've gone from sleeping peacefully again when thinking about equity in chemistry. The more I work and think and dig and read, the deeper the rabbit hole becomes. But I'm enjoying the challenge, and I think it's worthwhile. So maybe one day we'll be resting peacefully again, but until then, we're wide awake and working on this. But again, if you're looking for permission to start, I don't really know what I'm doing for the most part when I got started, but there's a body of literature and tons of people who are doing this in their own fields to connect to, who are excited to see growth in other fields kind of on this subject. So again, if you need permission to jump in or to think or to experiment how little it might be, please do, and please share with the community. So with that, I want to say thank you guys for being here on a Monday night, and thank you to the CSN and NSF for having me. It's been an awesome summer. I've really enjoyed it. Let's see. I really appreciate the way you found a way to make this empowering. Oh, thank you. Yeah, when I'm thinking, I draw. So I decided to incorporate it. But yeah, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And if you're looking for my contact information, feel free to email me and contact me and reach out.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. And I think I can speak for the audience when I say, I mean, I found it very inspiring and informative. Christy says on slide 11, when you were talking about failing better, I find myself wondering how you think about that in the context of cancel culture.
Oh man. Okay. So cancel culture. I don't really like cancel culture. I go back and forth. So I exist in multiple places where I have conflicting thoughts. I don't think it completely exists. I think people might be mad at something, and like the internet says they're canceled, but it doesn't really change a lot that happens in their lives. I think that happens a good bit, and there's mob mentality. But I think the idea that if somebody isn't doing what we want, that we can just throw them away and never think of them ever again, I don't think that works if we're going for equity. At the same time, you have another extreme where, well, what if there's just somebody who's just completely resistant to change and doesn't want to do XYZ? What do you do? And I don't have an answer for that either. But I think at least within the context of the classroom, I think there's very little that a student can do, or that a student can reasonably do, that makes them irredeemable for a second chance. I think within the classroom, the stakes should be low enough that is never an issue. Oh, wait. Oh, there's a...
Sorry.
Oh, no worries.
Natalie says, I find We Do This Till We Free Us by Kaba helpful for these kinds of complicated, twisty accountability justice questions. Thank you for that recommendation.
Oh, yeah. I'll add it to my reading list. Let's see. I do this till we free us.
And then, I just... Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, but yeah, it's complicated. I think it depends on the context, because there are certainly like things that I might avoid, or people that I avoid or don't follow on social media. But I guess maybe it depends on what we're saying canceled is. Is me unfollowing somebody canceling them? I don't think so. I don't go out of my way to like, tell people, hey, don't do this, don't do that, don't support this person. I generally don't do that ever. But I think I set boundaries for myself, and I try to exist within those for the most part. Yeah, I don't know if that helps.
I was going to ask maybe a related question, for students for whom your class might be the first time that they're presented with a structure like this, anything like ungrading or the learning framework that you described. Does it take them a little bit to adjust
Yes.
to not having to like, but I need to get my quiz, I need to get my 10 out of 10 or whatever, and like how do they, have you found techniques to kind of help them wrap their minds around this new paradigm you're trying to use?
So I wasn't very good at this last year. So I'm looking forward to this year and trying some new things. So my approach last year was to have revisions. So for any assessment, students can do revisions, and I gave them feedback and a grade. But we fell into the cycle where if a student didn't get a perfect 100, they would resubmit it. And because I'm not trying to just like give them the answer. I want them to like think and like dig in their book and like kind of, come to their own conclusions. We were walking this tightrope of like, I'm trying not to be too vague, but trying to point them in the direction. And then also I'm not being effective at it. And so they're not really getting what I'm saying. And so I was in this spiral of endless grading, where as soon as I like completed everything that I had to grade, it was all back because it was never because it wasn't 100%. So that certainly didn't work on that front, and kind of like alleviating the stress from grades. I think students were less stressed about needing to be perfect the first time, but this idea that they still needed to be perfect was still there. Even if they had a 90%, at least for our school, we don't have like A+ or A-. A 90 at the end of the semester is the same as a 99, but because there was that number there, they were fixated on it. I'm looking forward to seeing how it goes this semester. I got IRB approval this past week, but we're doing a feedback only course. So no assignments will have a grade on it. And because the only grades that I have to turn in are midterms and finals. So my students and I were going to meet, and they're going to propose a grade, and we're going to kind of go through their work through the semester. And that's going to be what it is, unless there's not like evidence, and then we'll talk about it. So I think that is going to be another hurdle that will be interesting to navigate. I'm not sure how. I know how other students have responded to it and like other people who've tried it, but I don't think I've seen anybody try this in chemistry. So we'll see how that goes.
Exciting.
Yeah.
Congrats on the IRB approval. That's a big deal too.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited. I think, at least from what I've read from other people, students have a hard time wrapping their head around it. But I think it's also worth it to give students space for their needs. Like if a student is working a full-time job and they have a family, like it's unreasonable for me to expect them to do like 30 homework assignments across like the semester with like 15 problems each. And so I think students might appreciate being able to choose and add it to the portfolio of their work throughout the semester. But we'll see. Maybe something else comes up and none of that ends up being on the forefront of students' minds.
Well, thank you for your thoughtful answers. Do we have any other questions before we wrap up?
Oh, thank you. Yeah,
Absolutely.
after this past year, I was like, I joke about like being sleepless. I really was sleepless for a while after the past school year, because it wasn't very clear what things would look like in the fall. It's still very unclear what things will look like this semester, and I knew I had a lot of room to improve, and I was feeling very driven to try something, because I thought my students deserved better.
Which is, I mean, yeah, that's not to be taken lightly for many people. Just their own, you know, getting through the day, taking that extra initiative for the sake of your students is wonderful.
Yeah,
and we really appreciate learning from you about it tonight.
Yeah, this was great. I hope at some time later I can share how this semester's gone.
Yeah, we'll have to do a follow-up. Like,
yeah.
Stay tuned for the update.
Yeah, for part 2.
Yeah.
Did students completely hate it? I think if we at least get to the point where students are like, okay, yeah, this was okay. I think I'll be okay. I think I'll be good with that.
Well, I think
there we go.
Yeah, I think if there's no last questions, I encourage people obviously to get in touch by email or over Twitter. I appreciate we're sort of Twitter buddies with Sustainable Nano and Dr. Gaines.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always a lot of fun. And we also, you know, look forward to hearing more progress on your gaming work and other kind of educational innovations and stuff. So thank you so much again for your time, and we'll make sure that this recording is available through our website, and we'll get it out there, because I think lots of people are going to want to check it out.
And I can send you the slides too.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. Thanks so much to everyone who attended, and have a great evening.
Yeah, thank you guys. Have a great evening.